Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 16th virtual event of the 6th Unbound Book Festival. My name is Fong Wen, and I'm a member of the Planning Committee for Unbound. This event is Changing Landscapes in YA Fiction, featuring the extraordinarily talented writers Anuradha Rajurkar, Brie Spangler, and Louisa Onome. And you are in for a fabulous evening. As you may know, the festival has always been completely free to attend, and this wouldn't be possible without the generosity of the hundreds and hundreds of people who have supported us financially over the years. On behalf of everyone who volunteers for Unbound and everyone who attends these events, we're so grateful to each and every one of you who has been kind enough to give. A list of everyone who has given over the past 2 years is on the website, and if you'd like to contribute yourself, you can do so by going to the website and clicking on the donate button. We're a registered nonprofit, and we are completely run by volunteers, so everything we receive goes directly into putting on these events. Thank you. Support comes too from the City of Columbia, specifically the Office of Cultural Affairs and the Convention and Visitors Bureau. KBIA and Como Magazine are our media sponsors. A full list of sponsors and supporters is available on the website. Particular thanks this evening to tonight's event sponsor, Skylark Bookshop in Columbia, Missouri. We're very grateful to them for their support over the years. Tonight, one person who asks our featured speaker a question will receive a copy of all of these writers' books, courtesy of Skylark Bookshop. So if you have any questions for them as the event proceeds, please type them into the comments and the moderator will ask them at the end of the event. Then after the Q&A, I will hop on to announce the winner. Please remember that if you miss an event, everything is available for viewing or reviewing on both our Facebook page and on YouTube. If you haven't already, please do take a moment to review the whole schedule, all 3 months of it, on our website and plan to attend as many events as you like. While you're there, you can also sign up for the festival newsletter, which goes out on Monday mornings and will keep you up to date with what to expect each week. And please tell your friends about the festival. Now, please welcome Kim McCaffrey, a faculty member at University of Missouri, who will be moderating this panel. Kim?
Hi. Thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. I just spent the weekend reading 3 fantastic novels, so I'm really looking forward to introducing you to these wonderful writers if you have not already become acquainted with their work. And I'm going to start by having each of the authors read for just a couple of minutes, and then I've got some questions and we'll have a lovely conversation. And as Fong mentioned, please feel free to type any questions you have in the comments area. So we will have a Q&A session later as well. And I'm going to go ahead and have the authors read just in alphabetical order to make it simple. So we will start with Louisa Onome. And Louisa is coming to us from Toronto. She has a BA in professional writing from York University, and this is her wonderful debut novel, Like Home. So Louisa, please favor us with your reading.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim. Hi, everyone. So yeah, just as Kim mentioned, Like Home is my debut novel. Just really quickly, it's the story of a 16-year-old girl who's dealing with tough changes in her neighborhood, like her friendships are changing and the fabric of what makes her home unique is slowly shifting. It's a story about friendship, it's about community and what it really means to change. So I'm going to read just a little bit from chapter 5. Just, I guess, a bit of backstory. So what has sort of happened so far is that we are kind of introduced to our main character, Chinello, or Nello, as she goes by. And this is kind of the start of a school day. And usually her and her best friend, Kate, head to the bus stop together. And so she wakes up and she's trying to figure out where Kate is. So, okay. So chapter 5. Kate doesn't text me in the morning on Monday. Usually she does. She sends something like, "I'm up," with an upside down smiley face. She does that because she knows that if she doesn't, I'll call her, and she absolutely hates picking up the phone in the morning. Kate isn't a morning person. I'm throwing the rest of my outfit together for school. Black shirt, black leggings, denim jacket. My shirt says all black in the center in black lettering, and the letters pop more than usual today. I know that if my mom sees, she's going to mention the bra, so I gotta dip before she gets out of the shower. Mom didn't turn on the bathroom fan, so the steam is seeping into the cramped hallway. It's making me sweat, and it's way too early to start sweating. After snatching my phone off the table, I head down the hall and stuff my feet into my shoes. Bye, Mom, I call, even though I know she can't hear me. I'm dialing Kate's number and her phone is ringing off the hook. The call goes straight to voicemail. Ugh, I grumble and text her instead. Where the hell are you? I doubt she'll reply before I walk up to the store. She's probably there, helping out her mom before the bus shows up again. Maybe she'll slip me another Vita ice cream. The normal quiet hum of the street is gone. Instead, the air is tense and thick with something foreign. It's weird. Usually the undesirables, the ugliness of the neighborhood, hide while the kids come out to play. The second we're at school, the busyness, the good and the bad starts back up again. But today, there's this creepy rustling in the distance and it's loud, like crunching papers, broken glass. And there's the voices, lots of them, speaking quietly but forcefully. It's a hum. Step back, and stay behind the line, they say. Oh my God, cries another. My feet quicken along the sidewalk. They're scraping now in these new shoes. New shoes are always like that, so loud and awkward. I have to press my feet into them harder and wiggle my toes more so they feel like home. I can see people now, a small crowd with phones out gathering at the intersection at the end of the street. That's where Ginger Store is. I'm running. My feet come to a stop at the sight of police cars, two of them blocking traffic one way, and yellow caution tape sloped lazily from signpost to signpost. And the police are blocking the shop. They're blocking Ginger Store. They're trying to make sure no one goes in. I rush past the crowd and nearly smash into a police officer. Kate, I call over his shoulder. He has his hands gripped tightly around my wrists and I can't fight him off. Miss, we're gonna need you to step back, he says. He's being calm, but I can't hear anything, can't really see much over his tall, lanky figure. He twists a little to the right, and that's when I finally see it. I hold my breath, gazing, gaping at this large, uneven hole in the shop window. Thanks.
Thank you, Louisa. That was just a great setup for some questions I have later
Awesome.
about the way you create that sense of place in the novel and that the important friendship between Nilo and Kate, too. So thank you very much. Next up, we're going to hear from Anuradha Rajurkar. She is from Evanston, Illinois, the proud daughter of South Asian immigrant parents. She has 2 degrees from Northwestern University and became a public school teacher and fortunately also writing in her spare time, right? So when American Betiya was just a manuscript, it was honored with the nationwide Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators Emerging Voices Award. And when she's not writing or reading, she's doing lots of healthy things like hiking with her family and obsessing over her plants and watching old horror flicks. One of my favorite things to do as well. She hopes that her stories will inspire teens to embrace their unique identities and inner badass despite the outside pressures and cultural expectations. So American Betiya is her first novel. So thank you for reading for us. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thanks for having me. So my novel is American Betiya, and it is a cross-cultural love story that follows 18-year-old Ronnie, who gets swept up in the euphoria of first love when she first meets Oliver, but it is the challenges that they encounter as an interracial couple that allow her to recognize real love for what it is. It's a story that explores cultural taboos, immigrant family boundaries, and the complicated relationship between love and culture. It also features a lot of bassy food, a lot of funny best friend banter, intergenerational experiences, sex positivity, and an illuminating trip to India, where Ronnie learns a lot about her family and her heritage and how that impacts her developing sense of identity. So I am going to read from just the very first page. Now, Ronnie is somebody who really loves photography, and she finds herself in her first gallery show at the high school. It's a very large high school that she goes to. And it is in this scene that she first meets this love interest, Oliver. But before that, we get to meet all of Ronnie's family friends that come to the gallery show to view her latest installation. Chapter 1. He's my mother's worst nightmare. His intricate tattoos and the way he's been covertly studying me from across the gallery would give her palpitations for sure. Dude does need some manners, I think, as he stashes away several damaged portfolio sleeves before glancing over again. Avoiding his gaze, I turn to arrange my glossy artist statement cards. Seriously, who is this guy? I take a long swig from my water bottle and attempt to refocus. It's my first ever gallery night opening, and I'm still in shock that I was invited. My photographs, the ones I took with my grandfather in India last summer, pop against the burgundy walls. Artwork is hung floor to ceiling, and modern sculptures on pedestals are strategically placed and uplit like deities. I submitted my photos to the student art show on a whim, and amazingly, they were chosen. Framed, polished, and practically art, they're gleaming images of India that I can't stop looking at, despite having seen them 1,000 times before. Across the room, the guy's eyes flicker to me again, and I flush when he catches me looking. I pretend to study a nearby sculpture. If only I could lurk behind my camera lens, I'd avoid all this nonsense. I need to recenter. I am calm. I am confident. I am legit. A fresh stream of gallery goers comes pouring through the double doors, and I brace myself, flashing my brightest smile. Some of them I know a little too well. Close family friends I call my auntie uncles spill in like a wedding barat minus the horse. A sight in the prim atmosphere, a crowd blinged out in jewel-toned saris and yellow gold. They're Indian Standard Time late, but quickly make themselves at home. Calling my name, they come barreling into my corner, the aunties shrieking as they kiss and hug me, the uncles raising their glasses in a toast, having already somehow descended upon the nearby refreshments. Eyes flicker to us, some shining in wonder, drinking in the scene, and others bemused, like we're a comedy. I love these guys, but God. Proud you're showcasing our India with these photos, Ronnie, Veena auntie says, chucking me under the chin while making a smooching sound. Goodness knows we need more representation in the arts. Veena auntie is my artsy auntie. She's a potter when she's off dental duty and probably the only one who gets the magnitude of my being here. I squeeze her hand. A dozen auntie uncles now cluster around me, chatting and ignoring the artwork. And then, as if there's not enough of a scene, my parents bustle in. Baba shuffles across the gallery floor, hands in his pockets, while peering at the pomp and circumstance of an event devoted to something as self-indulgent as art. Beside him marches Ma in a blazing coral sari, one of the favorites she wears for Indian parties. She scans the gallery critically, a Mumbai mama bear ready to take out anyone who messes with her family. God.
Thank you, Anuradha. I'm really looking forward to exploring some of the issues of family that you write about, as well as the cultural details later. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Our third author is Brie Spangler. And Brie graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design, which was also referenced actually in Anuradha's book, by the way. And Brie has, in addition to writing her debut YA novel, she has also written and illustrated for 2 picture books and is currently working on a graphic novel for middle school kids. But today she is going to treat us to a reading from her novel Beast.
Thank you very much. I'm Brie. Thank you for having me. I want to acknowledge that I am on Louisa Onome land before I begin reading. So my story, Beast, is Beauty and the Beast. There's no other way to say it. It is based on the fairy tale of a very beastly boy who falls for a very attractive young lady, except there's no kidnapping, I suppose. You know what I mean. It's basically the outline. So anyway, he is big, huge, tall. He really is not a fan of himself. And he meets this girl who kind of has a better handle on being who she is than he's ever known in himself, and it kind of throws him for a loop. So when we get into this passage, they skip their group therapy class to go play hooky in a park and hang out and get to know one another a little better, and a kiss might have been snuck. Okay, so Dylan says, Jamie, I'm so into you. I'm nervous telling her that, but her smile is so big, I know it's okay. Points, points, points. She leans in, lightly pressing her lips to mine. I'm lightheaded. We kiss, but it's stubborn. Each heartbeat grows more scattered and clueless than the last. We try too hard to be every movie we've ever seen, and it's awful. She angles her head. I do the same, but it's the wrong side, and we buck. I laugh, but I'm too embarrassed. I've read how many books, and I've seen how many movies, and this is putting study into practice. I feel like a fraud. There's a wall of gritted teeth keeping me out. It's like she's terrified. I am too, because this is my first real kiss. This one actually counts, and I want it to be good. Scratch that. I want it to be amazing. I want this day to never end, but she's not there. I pull away. You okay? Her eyes are clenched shut. No. Can we stop? My insides collapse. The cliff slides into the ocean. I'm scared, she whispers. It's so unfair. I know what her lip gloss tastes like now. Pineapple. Did I do something wrong? Jamie opens her eyes. Her hand is soft as it touches my cheek. No, she says firmly. You're wonderful. Warmth creeps up my spine and floods my chest. Another person who's not my mom or another blood relative thinks I'm wonderful. We don't have to do anything if you don't want to. Her head plunks against my chest. Thank you, she murmurs. We'll just pretend it never happened. So I reach for her camera and place it in her lap. Here, take some pictures. She pushes it to the side. The only subject I want to capture is off limits. I reach for the camera, take off the lens cap, and turn it on. The SLR chatters itself digitally awake, flinging the lens in and out with a jolt. I hand it to Jamie. Knock yourself out. Really? I take a deep breath. Really. She aims the camera at me. My face twitches into a smile. It feels worse than getting my back waxed, but I want to do it for her. Be natural, she says, her finger on the button. Pretend I'm not here. Impossible. All right, then think of something that makes you happy. I think of her and turn red. She fires a million shots, and I dunk myself backwards on the grass to soak up the sun. Jamie hovers and slinks up alongside me, snapping shots again and again. There's no place I'd rather be. There's nothing I'd rather be doing. In the distance, little kids squeal and play, and I feel like one of them. That magical time when you were really, really small, and all that mattered was finding an open swing. Back when you let go and ran for however the hell you wanted to, before other people's opinions mattered. Being with Jamie feels like that. Free and good. I didn't know one person could make you a better version of yourself. And the sun is shining down and saying, welcome to the world, dummy. Tale as old as time.
Thank you, Brie. I love it that you read that particular passage where she says, be natural. Right, because I want to come back to issues of inclusion and representation and embracing your identity in our discussion. So, but the first question actually I have for all of our authors is I just would be interested to hear on what drew you to writing a YA novel and what particular opportunities do you see in YA fiction, or what possible challenges did you find in writing YA fiction? And Brie, if you want to go ahead and start us off.
Well, I started out in art school, and I was an illustration major, and so I was convinced, like, I'll just go draw pictures for the rest of my life, and that will be fine. And then the 2008 financial collapse happened, and I found myself to be very unemployed very quickly, because all of a sudden nobody needed any drawings of anything. So I was very, very bored, and I started writing, and I was like, wow, this is really hard. This is very difficult. Who knew? And like, before you knew it, I just started writing, and I was drawn to young adult novels writing because it's such a wonderful, fantastic wild time in your life, like the things that you remember being crystal clear and vivid 25 years later, they stay with you forever. And I love that.
Louisa, what drew you to YA?
Yeah, it's so weird because I think like I'd always wanted to write, and I think at a point when I was a little bit younger, I was like, oh, I'm going to write adult fiction just because I thought that that's kind of what I had to do. Like, especially in Canada, a lot of the literary canon is like literary fiction, and I'm like, well, if I want to be a writer, I was write literary fiction. But I think my voice always skewed a bit young anyway. Like, I think naturally my interests tend to skew a bit young, and all that sort of stuff. And I tend to, just the way Brie kind of described, like, you remember a lot of these experiences from your youth and from your childhood, and like they just stick with you. And I think that those types of stories always really kind of enticed me more than maybe what I had known of traditional adult fiction at the time. Yeah, I don't know. I just really like how fresh and new YA is, and how there's like so much opportunity to tell different kinds of stories. I think is really cool. So yeah.
And Anuradha, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's like a little bit of what both of Louisa and Brie have mentioned. It's, on some level though, I remember being really shy as a child, and so I was always reading. It was such an easy escape for me, and I honestly felt as though those characters from when I was young were friends in a sense, and helped me through, so many experiences, struggles that are kind of universal. And as I became older and became a teen, the books that I was reading didn't necessarily reflect what I was experiencing, and those who kind of like shared my culture were experiencing. They were still incredibly impactful, and important in my, sense of myself. But it was around that time that I started to feel like I really would love to write a book that, is kind of closely aligns with things that I and my friends who sort of share my cultural background are going through. And so I think that was that time when I decided I one day I want to do this. And then I became a teacher and used literature so much in my classroom, as part of my curriculum. And I noticed that around that time, there were more books that were available for people from various backgrounds. And it always opened up such incredible conversations in the classroom. Like, it really got us there was like sort of a sense of inclusion and trust, and the conversations that would come out of that, that sort of dialogue was really, it was amazing in how it sort of transformed the classroom culture and environment. So it was around that time I thought, I am gonna do this. Like, one of these days I'm going to, finally realize this dream. And it wasn't until I left teaching and stayed home for 10 years to raise my kids. Of course, we were going to the library constantly. And so I was reading children's books a lot with them, picture books. They were little. And so I would get a babysitter and I would go across the street and start writing. At the time, I decided to just get into short stories because they were shorter, and my kids were so young and active. And I thought, okay, this is something I can write a short story. And so the short story was actually the beginning of American Betiya. It was the story of American Betiya in a short form. I met somebody who was a fellow author, and she invited me to her writing group, and they all decided. I didn't even really know it was YA at the time. I don't think, sort of like Louisa, I kind of thought, oh, maybe I should be writing literary fiction. I didn't know that much about YA. I wasn't reading a lot of YA at the time. It was all short stories and literary fiction. And so at that time, it was the writing group that said, this voice reminds us of YA. We think you should flesh this out into a novel and write, to have it be a YA novel. And it was just such an amazing moment to have that permission from people who I trusted. I mean, it was just a wonderful writing group, really supportive and talented. So that was what got me to finally sit down and hammer it out. And it took me many years, but that was like my little origin story.
Well, you bring up two things I thought were particularly interesting when you talked about the fact that, when you were growing up, you wished that, there was more representation, right, of your culture and so forth. And you also talked about how when you introduced more multicultural literature in the classroom, that there was just, the students really embraced it and you had these rich discussions. So I was just wanting, again, to hear from all of you about how do you think diversity is progressing in the YA market? Do you have a sense that things are really evolving on that front, or? Brie, I don't know if you have any ideas about that, or?
Sure. I was going to say, well, my book came out in 2016 and Jamie is trans. And I think when I started writing it in 2010, Anuradha already knows the story, but I had like a little sit down coffee talk with an editor and she was like, what are you working on? And I was like, well, I'm writing a story about a straight cis boy who falls for a straight trans girl. And she was like, oh, it'll never sell. No one wants to read that. And I was like, well, I'm gonna write it anyway because I want to write this story because I believe love is love. And so I wrote the story and it came out 5 years ago-ish now. And I think the direction where YA has gone, I would now step back and I would maybe not be the one to write the story because I myself am not trans. And I just feel as though, own voices should definitely write those stories.
And Louisa, do you have a sense of how the diversity is being embraced in YA? And I'm also curious if you see much of a difference between the Canadian and the US market in that regard.
Ooh, I'm not too sure about differences. I think it's funny because even thinking about that now, most of the YA authors I know in Canada are people of color, but I think it's just because I've learned about them recently through a festival I volunteer with. And so to me, it seems like, oh, there's like things are changing, things are progressing like in a good direction. But it could just be that maybe my bubble is just like, I'm very fortunate to kind of know of a lot of authors who are Black, who are Indigenous in Canada, who are people of color as well. I feel overall though, just kind of like thinking back to when I like I guess the time when like Twilight was a thing and like the Hunger Games and all of that, like during that moment in YA. And I guess looking there and then seeing now, it does, like, I do feel a bit of a difference. I think it's cool that a lot of different people are getting the opportunity to tell stories from their perspective, about their intersections, about just like their lives and the lives of people like them. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to say if I can like definitively, if I feel like, oh, there's been a huge change, but I can tell like year after year that there is just kind of like a bit more than there was last year. And I think it's cool. I think just the way we had mentioned before, like it really does open up a lot of discussion with people when you kind of are reading from different experiences and different backgrounds.
And Anuradha, do you think that there has been much of a change since the days when you were teaching, for example, or?
Absolutely. It does feel like there's a change. I mean, I know that there's a lot of work left to be done in the industry in terms of incorporating lots of different voices, but I do feel like that movement is there. We're moving in that direction. And, in terms of sort of culturally, I feel like the conversations we're having as a culture are sort of demanding for more stories from different corners and, different cultural backgrounds and things like that. So I do feel like that is driving some of that demand is just there. And I think that the demand is being answered. It's hard to say in terms of like actual numbers, but I do feel like I just hear more about books and, hear people sort of raving about books from, people from all different walks of life. So that's really exciting. It's exciting to be part of that wave in a sense.
And kind of related to this issue as well, how important do you feel that, for all of you again, that having representation, having diversity in these novels can really have an impact on teenagers, right? How much of a, how important or powerful of a tool do you think that might be? Louisa, do you have any sense of that, or?
Yeah, actually, I would say overall, yes, I feel like it has had a pretty good impact on a lot of younger people. I think my biggest frame of reference, just kind of like using myself or just thinking back to like my experiences in high school and in middle school, and just kind of really wanting to, or not even wanting to see that representation, but not realizing that I didn't have it, I think is probably a bit more accurate. Like now in hindsight, every now and then when I see things where I feel like, oh, this, like I kind of relate to this in a different way because maybe the protagonist is the same background as me, or the experience is like quite specific to my experience, then I realize like, oh, I didn't realize I didn't have this, like I didn't know. And so I think it's pretty cool now that there's less, that sort of thing would probably be happening less, that there's probably a lot more kids who are reading something and they probably, you know, maybe they didn't care that much about representation, or they just like weren't sure how necessary it was, and then they kind of see themselves on, whether it's on screen or on the page, and then recognize like, oh, this is something that is important to them, or this is something that is important to move things forward. Just like having more people represented.
And Anuradha, how do you feel about that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I also feel like there is, you know, to feel like there are things reflected in these stories that are actually helpful. You know, I mean, it would have been so helpful for me to have read American Betiya when I was in high school or even college, you know, because there are issues in there, issues of like microaggressions or issues of, you know, just basic cultural conflict within intimate relationships. It's not something that I feel like I feel like it's talked about that much. So to have just being able to watch another character in a book struggle through things that happen with quite a lot of regularity, if we are being honest, would have been just so transformative. I feel like, you know, I think there was a sense, at least at that stage, it was a long time ago now, but at that stage in life, it definitely felt like these are things that we must not speak about, you know, even to one another. It's almost something that you didn't even have the lexicon for, you know, back then the word microaggression didn't really exist. Whereas now, you know, the characters in the book are talking about it, and the characters in the book are talking about the word, you know, the words cultural fetishization, for example, or racial gaslighting. I mean, these are things that really are part of our regular everyday experiences, whether they're happening to you or whether they're happening to people that you know. To see characters dealing with that and actually labeling that, I think would be just a really powerful experience and just sort of useful on a day-to-day level.
And Brie, you mentioned that when you originally started the novel back around 2010, I think you said, that you were sort of discouraged from writing a trans story, that you said, this is the story I want to write. Were you thinking in terms of what kind of impact it could have, or how helpful it might be for an audience at that time, or?
Not as like a resource, but like as just a story that I hadn't seen very much of. And I think like there were, I think, what was it, Parrotfish, Luna, you know, and a lot of those early trans YA books, as the years have gone on, have, well, I don't want to disparage anybody, but that you can read the good reviews for yourself. But I think like time changes your perceptions, and so what may have been revolutionary 15 years ago is now ill-conceived representation. And I think probably the best points that people have made about stories like mine is like, why isn't Jamie telling this story? You know, like, why isn't she's the one that we want to know more about? Like, and if that is the case, then like I wouldn't be the one writing it. I don't know. It's a tricky thing because I did write the book, and I love these characters, and I love that they are dealing with all of this teenage, all those wonderful messes that we all enjoyed back in the day together. But it's like, I also recognize that when it's time to take a step back so that other people can write better stories, then it's okay.
And next, I want to talk a little bit about the voice that you each really richly depicted in your novels. And I also want to just remind the audience that type away in the comment box with any questions that you have for our authors. And keep in mind that also one audience member who writes a comment will win a book too. So, but I was, Louisa, I'll start with you in terms of the question about point of view and character voice, right? I was really struck at how effectively you were able to use the teenage slang and their use of technology, right? All of those great conversations they were having in the chat on their phones and so forth. And I was wondering how easy or difficult was it for you to kind of create that voice in your novel?
Yeah, thank you. I want to say it's like a half and half sort of thing. Like on one hand, it did come very easily just because, I don't know, like even kind of going back to how I had said, like a lot of my interests tend to skew a bit younger. I always find that, I don't know, there's just like freshness in like newer technologies and like things that young people are really interested in. And so I always tend to gravitate towards that. And so because of that, like the way that I sort of wrote their group chats is similar to like the way myself and my siblings are in our group chats, or like myself and my friends. And so just really being able to kind of draw from personal experience there was really helpful. I kind of blanked on the rest of your question. Did you mention it was about voice? Okay.
Right, like the slang and everything, right? Because it just seems like there are new words coming out every day. And I don't know how I would ever know or be able to keep up with how the kids are talking these days, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. And I think even with that, like there was a lot of instances where I had to kind of tone things down and take stuff out. Just because like being from Toronto and my characters are based in like a fictional Toronto neighborhood as well, a lot of the words we kind of use here are not super regional or sorry, they're like very regional, and they're not, they wouldn't kind of be understood in different places. And so I had to kind of tweak those, but still make it pretty authentic to their experience. So yeah, it was just, I think a lot of, like, to be honest, just kind of paying attention to like my younger cousins, really just trying to understand them and their point of view. I have a younger brother as well. So like, it was just interesting to kind of hang around with him and like listen to him talk and all that kind of stuff, just to really sort of get into that mind frame. Yeah, I think it was just a combination of like all of those things, and really just trying to make sure that the type of person who I wanted to read this book, I was really imagining like kids from different neighborhoods in the Toronto area, that I didn't want to write something that they would pick up and then feel like I was like lying or I didn't do a good job representing them or anything like that. So first and foremost, I really just wanted to make sure that I was kind of being authentic to kids in those areas.
And Anuradha, it was interesting in your book too that you combined some Indian words and so forth, right? Some of the different cultural words, slang in some senses, and of course lots of food references and so forth. And I was wondering sort of how you decided, when to bring in those details, and trusting that your audience would understand these things even without the same cultural background.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kim, because I feel like the first draft was very much just, you're in that fugue state of just stream of consciousness. The words are coming. You're not really thinking necessarily about who's going to be reading it, or are they going to understand what this is? And so I do feel like that editing process was what was the most helpful in terms of, the editor saying, okay, I like that you're keeping this word in here that is a Hindi word, but can you give some sort of cultural clue or contextually, will people who don't speak Hindi be able to somehow pick up on some level what that word might mean? So it was a weird, it was a really cool exercise actually, in trying to keep things really seamless for those readers who do know Hindi, so that you don't feel like you're kind of othering like their culture as they're reading, by, say italicizing, which I think they, used to happen quite a lot in the past, italicizing words that are in other languages. So that was one thing that was it was an interesting process to have to go through and think, okay, do I really, how can I get people to really understand on some level what's being said here without having to spell it completely out? So that's how I managed that. And in terms of the foods, that was more just, I feel like food is so universal now. It's a universal language in and of itself. So many people know about so many different dishes, and I just decided I'm not going to spend too much time trying to define what aloo gobi is. It's like, if someone's really not sure, it's really an easy thing to Google. So it was actually my editor who was like, we don't need to spell every single thing out. So it was sort of walking that line. And in terms of the voice, yeah, I mean, I feel like sort of like what Louisa was saying, I have teen boys myself. And so being around them, and we were very close. And so I just feel like I was kind of a part of that teen spirit a lot, with the friends coming over and just having conversations with my boys. But yes, I do hear everything that you were saying, Louisa. I definitely was struggling with on some level too, just making sure that, the language is really authentic to a teen voice. And in Ronnie's case, somebody who is also dealing with, sort of identity issues with relation to her culture. So yeah, it's a lot of times you can sort of slip out of that voice in the drafting process, but the critique partners and the editor and all the different sort of people who are reading can help keep that on track.
And Brie, like the other novels, of course, you had the teenagers using technology and so forth, but I thought it was also an interesting twist in your book that his mom was tracking him with the phone app at one point. I thought that was kind of an interesting little twist there. But also to come back to what you were saying earlier, when we're talking about voice in the book, you said, some people would ask, well, why isn't the book from Jamie's perspective, right? Through her voice. But I was really struck by, what an endearing character Dylan is. And I was wondering if you felt any particular challenges by adopting the voice of a 15-year-old boy in your novel.
Well, that was kind of fun a little bit, because I grew up 15 minutes outside of Foxborough Stadium, so we had Patriots in my town all the time. Some of them lived there, and I just remember going to the buffet in town, and the Patriots would come in at lunchtime, and they would take all of the food in the restaurant and go like this and eat it and put it down and just leave. And I just remember being like, oh, because I was yay-hoo big, and they were large, they were huge, they were massive, they were big dudes. And I used to work at McDonald's that was next to Foxborough Stadium, so I would check out everybody after the Patriots games. This was when they were losers and they lost all the time. This is very pre-Tom Brady. So anyway, that is my mental structure kind of for Dylan, is just huge, big, massive. So the body of a football player, but the mouth of somebody who just watched the Patriots lose. So, jaded, bitter, sassy, whatever. And ordering chicken nuggets and a Big Mac and a large fry and extra Cokes. No Happy Meals though, because no one's happy. So
that also brings me to a question for each of you about the idea of teenagers. On the one hand, obviously, in each of your books, you're capturing some of that coming-of-age story, right? The teenagers wrestling with their identities, wrestling with their place in the world, or afraid that they're going to lose their place in the world, in a sense, in Louisa's book, right? But I was wondering what you think about that idea of teenagers while yes, they're growing, yes, they're changing, yes, they have their future ahead of them, is there still a sense, though, that it's important to capture teenagers as whole characters, right? That they're not just like kids sitting around waiting to grow up, but that they're have a full identity even as they're growing. Louisa, did you feel that in your book, like a strong sense of Nilo is a full character? Or
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's so interesting about like being 17, being 16, 17, because just remembering back to like my experience and even like some of my younger cousins that I speak to, like that a lot of people at that time, like when you're that age, you really like feel like you kind of, well, for the most part, and not for everybody, but for the most part, you kind of feel like you know what you're doing, or like you have like a sense of self that's kind of different, I think, than when you're an adult. Like when I remembering like back when I was 16, though I wasn't like the most outgoing or the most this or whatever, and I was still pretty unsure about the way things were going to be kind of in the future, I still kind of felt like I knew myself to a certain degree. And I think that that sort of knowing and that particular sense of self really does come from being that age at that time, sort of. So it was important for me to kind of be respectful of that as well, because I think one thing, especially with YA, like you don't want to be disingenuous when you're writing it, because the people who were reading it won't receive it very well, and that sort of thing. And I don't think it's like, if we're writing for teenagers, I don't think it's necessary to sort of to take on that preachy sort of voice. And so to me, it's really important to kind of make sure that each of my characters was well-rounded and authentic to not only who I wanted them to be, like in the course of the story, but also to their age group, right? Like there's a lot of times, and some of the feedback that I've gotten about my main character and Nello's personality is that it's like, she's very in other people's business and like this and that. And I'm like, well, yeah, like she's 16, she's very passionate about something. Like what else do you expect her to do, kind of, right? So yeah, it's like, I definitely agree. Like making sure that each character is very well-rounded, but also authentic to who they're supposed to be and to their age is really important, I think, for YA.
And Brie, did you find any particular challenges in sort of creating this really rich sense of character for Dylan? I mean, he's such an interesting, full-fledged character. Did that just come pretty naturally to you, or?
It did. I'm sorry. I don't have a better answer. Yeah, I just liked him a lot and just got in his skin and just went with it. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. And Anuradha, how did you feel about developing, Ronnie as a real full, rich character at that age?
Yeah, I loved Ronnie's nuance. Actually, I loved how messy she was as a character, the decisions she would make, questionable decisions. It's just, to me, it was such a fun thing to write, to watch her walk into situations where she's kind of minimizing things. She's explaining certain like warning signs away. She's just hurtling forward anyway. I mean, that to me is one of the most fun things about that teen stage in life, is that at least with her character, she had spent so much of her life, her whole life really, doing good by her parents, like really, being on, a very kind of like wanting to just be a good student and having her whole life kind of planned out for her. She wants to be a pediatrician. So she's got just this really clear sense of herself. And yet she's sort of been quietly longing for love and to feel like she is not invisible and to be seen sort of in that way. So when Oliver comes along, despite certain red flags that come through, it's not that she doesn't notice them. She does. She still kind of hurtles forward anyway. And so that to me was just, it felt so real and it felt honest. So it was actually something that was not as hard to write as you would think, like that nuance is, she just seemed like such a formed character in my head because it was a story I wanted to write for so long. It was something that was in my mind for a long time. As a character, she kind of existed in my head for many years before I actually wrote anything down.
So I want to remind the audience again, if you want to go ahead and put any questions in the chat, the comments, excuse me, and we'll get to audience questions in just a few minutes. I did have another question for our authors about creating a sense of place in your novels. And Louisa, I'll go ahead and start with you because, of course, saving Ginger East, right, is such an important part of your novel, and it's the mission for Nello, right? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you drew on perhaps your own environment, your own experiences to create that rich sense of place in the novel.
Yeah, definitely. In Like Home, Ginger East is my fictional Toronto neighborhood. And it really is, I wanted to write it like it was a character itself. So Nello is very obsessed with it. Like she's kind of just like, this is where I live and there's nothing bad about it ever. So she's really not like trying to hear anything negative about where she's from. And so writing it from her perspective in particular is really interesting because it is a place with flaws, just like any other place. But I really kind of got the opportunity to sort of almost like put rose-colored glasses on. And that I think I took from my childhood experience as well. The way I sort of imagined the neighborhood was a little bit similar to the place that I grew up in. Not completely, like the place I grew up in when I was younger was purely residential. And Ginger East is kind of like a mix of commercial and residential. But I just really wanted it to be a place that, like for my main character in particular, like a place that really mirrored her a little bit, like just in the sense that like she saw herself reflected in her and the residents, like the setting was really reflected in the residents as well. And so that was really important for me when kind of coming up with Ginger East.
Nice. I really felt like I could see it, right? When I was reading your novel, I was like, I would love to go to Toronto anyway, but I just really felt like I got this idea of what it looked like, what it smelled like. I loved all the descriptions of the smells of the spices and how she was so disappointed when she went into the new store and it didn't smell like the spices, right? When she walked down the aisle and so forth. So I thought that was a great way to capture, the sense of place, and also again, the multicultural aspect that was so important to Ginger East as well. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Brie, I was wondering if you felt that it was particularly important to set your novel in Portland, or if there was, any particular reason why you wanted to use that backdrop.
I was living there at the time. I just cheated. I'm sorry. so it was, it was very rainy, but nice. Lots of good food.
Yeah, well, and I thought it was interesting that you had a scene in your novel where they go to a rose garden, except all of the roses, right, at that point have been pruned. And there's also a reference to a rose garden in Evanston, Illinois, in Anuradha's book. Right. And Anuradha, can you talk a little bit about why Evanston was kind of the ideal backdrop for you in the novel?
Well, it kind of goes along with what Brie said. It's like there's so much that you're creating when you're writing fiction that for me, setting it in Evanston's a very beautiful city. First of all, it's my hometown as well. From my childhood hometown, I should say. I don't live there anymore. But I did feel like it's kind of a dramatic place that's right along Lake Michigan. There's a lot of it's called Tree City. There's a lot of beautiful tall trees everywhere. There's a rose garden. There's just a lot of nature. And I felt like it was a really evocative kind of a setting. And for me, it ended up being sort of a love letter to my hometown, a love letter to Evanston. And going along with what Brie said, it's just so nice to not have to make up everything, not that it just felt like, okay, I know if I describe this place, I can just go back to my memory and describe it exactly. And it was, so it was kind of a freeing thing to be able to do in the midst of, creating plot and, having the twists and having these characters do crazy things. And, it just felt like, okay, this is something I can kind of rely on, just my simple, plain old memory in creating the scenes.
And one more question I have before we go to some audience questions. I was wondering, an interesting thing I noticed in all three of your novels is, of course, to a certain degree, they are all focusing on a sense of family. And in Louisa's novel in particular, too, I think a sense of family is like the whole neighborhood as a family, right? As well as the individual family. But what interested me is that in each of your novels, the protagonists do not have siblings.
Hmm.
And I was kind of curious to hear from each of you of sort of why you made that decision, or if it just kind of happened as you were writing. I don't know if you want to take that one first, Brie, or...
I'm laughing because it was easier. I was living in Portland, and it's easier only writing about one or two people. So I don't have a lot of depth there other than that. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, one of the things I loved in your novel was the relationship between Dylan and his mom. And, you know, there was always that, even though they had some conflict and there were some painful moments, you know, you just always had that sense that there was that bond there.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was something, again, that you sort of set out to create that strong relationship between them, or if that just kind of came as you were developing the story.
Well, there was in one of the earlier drafts an older sister who the writing group was like, unnecessary. She be gone. Take her out. And like there was this whole scene where like she was the one who was like, you know, waxing his back so he could go to the water park with his friends without everybody laughing at him and things like that. And everybody was like, keep the waxing, lose the sister. So it did. And I think that's where like his mom, well, okay, if there's no family other than like him and his mom, then they gotta lean on each other pretty hard, because it's hard being a kid and it's hard work being a mom. And so if you combine those two forces, you have, you know, the Wonder Twins. So.
And Louisa, what made you decide that Nello should be an only child?
Oh, I don't know. I really don't know. Even now thinking about it, I'm just like, oh, maybe she should have had a sibling, because it's weird. I think like in my community, like I'm Nigerian, a lot of Nigerian families, like everybody has siblings. So it's pretty common. Like I have two siblings. And so even thinking about it now, I'm like, oh, I don't know if it was a conscious decision to like not give her siblings, because I think in a real life situation, she would have them. I think on one hand, I did it to really emphasize like the friendships that she had as like family. And then on the other hand, I think it just like I just didn't think of it, even though I think it would have added a different layer to the story. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I could once again like kind of give a better answer, but I think I was just not conscious of the fact that I was doing it, and I really just wanted to highlight the friendships. So.
Right, and that's one thing that really struck me, right, is how close she was to her friend Kate, for example, and how Kate and Jake would refer to her like she was a sister.
Yeah.
And when when Kate's parents were introducing their kids, they would even refer to her as their daughter. So
Yeah.
I think that actually worked out really well for you, right? That
Right.
she didn't have any traditional siblings, because there was that great sense of family there, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and Anuradha, what did you think about making Ronnie, a single child in her family?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't know that I really like everyone else has said. I don't know that I really had thought too much about it. I knew that I wanted her to have a really close best friend, who, by the way, the best friend's also, her name is Kate. And part of it is that I wanted Kate to be outside of Ronnie's culture, because I wanted that, I wanted Ronnie to have sort of like a feminist, empowering female friendship in her life that was sort of somebody who could stand up for her and sort of call out things as they came up, sort of, especially with relation to her culture. And then there was also a grandmother, a very close, I wanted there to be an intergenerational component to American Betiya. And, Ronnie is very, very close with her grandmother and even her grandfather, who lives in India. So he's actually not part of the story on a day-to-day basis. But that was actually really important to me, to show how different Ronnie is with her parents versus her grandparents, that parental relationship can be so fraught. and it is so tumultuous in her case, but the grandparent relationship is just so much more sort of like universally like positive and like a positive force in her life. And so the book actually ended up being twice as long as what it is now when I finished. Like I was not really obviously paying attention to conventions very well. So it's like, it was already like too long of a book. And it just got to the point where I'm like, wow, I really need to like cut so much of this out. So there was an entire, section of the book that was a subplot of Kate's family life was in there. So I had to remove all of that. And so in the end, there was just simply no room for a sibling in this particular story.
Right. And I love it when Ronnie refers to her grandfather as her intergenerational twin. Right. So there was just, I love the bonds there. I'm going to go ahead and move on to a couple of audience questions now. So we have a question from Jennifer. She says, representation in YA books has really improved since I was growing up, and I'm glad to see that. What was your biggest challenge in writing for a YA audience? What was your biggest challenge?
I'll jump in. I guess kind of going back to what I had said before, just like really wanting to make sure I was genuine, like coming across genuine to the audience that I wanted to write for, and just trying to kind of same, like just being genuine, trying to tell the truth and all of that, and recognizing that there might be certain things that I'd put in that maybe an editor would kind of be like, I'm not too sure about this, but like if it's a certain audience that I'm trying to serve, and I recognize that that's something that would be meaningful to them, or that's something that would make sense to them, then really trying to make sure that that kind of stays part of the authentic experience. So yeah, I think that's probably was my biggest challenge, was just trying to kind of stay on brand and stay authentic to the readership.
I don't know if this is so closely related to specifically YA, but one of my biggest challenges with writing my book was the character of Oliver, because he's somebody that Ronnie falls for because he is charming, he is artistic, he's very talented, but he also has kind of a narrow view of Ronnie and her culture. And so it's like you wanted to show both. You wanted to show that he is really charming. And yes, this is somebody who we all are falling for as readers, as well as Ronnie. But he's also somebody who, through him, Ronnie starts to understand more about her own identity and sort of standing up for herself and understanding who she is in relation to her family and her culture. So it was a really difficult sort of line to walk, where you don't want to villainize him either, because he is somebody who struggles in his own right. And so, I think that was my biggest challenge in writing American Betiya specifically.
I just wanted to be respectful to the trans community, and I worked really closely with some trans women. Actually, a lot of the positive response I've gotten is from trans women who transitioned as adults, and they go back and they read this and they say, oh, I love this book so much because they have had so many different life experiences. So I think, like, listening to them and trying to be as respectful as I can within a teenager's realm of and to be honest, like Jamie's experience being trans has been lifelong, but also very short because she's still very young and her transitioning has only been less than a year. So, I just wanted to, I was not worried about Dylan. I wanted to be as good as I could possibly be to Jamie.
And another question we have here. So Louisa and Anuradha, at the beginning, you were talking about the distinction between YA fiction and literary fiction, right? And do you think there's a firewall between them, or do you think that YA fiction can also be literary?
I actually had a conversation about this with Kathleen Glasgow recently, who did an interview as part of my launch week. And I was talking about how my first love was always literary fiction. I'd always read that, and that was my focus in terms of just my own personal reading. And I'd always sort of dreamed of writing it one day. And I was telling her this, and she was like, "You're already writing literary fiction." So in her mind, it was like the way she said it too. I mean, it was interesting because I don't know that I was thinking about it that way until she said that. And then I thought, I think there is a lot of overlap between the two genres.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's funny because I don't think I've thought about it very much, but now just kind of like I guess, I don't know. It's hard because I also look at literary fiction and I always see literary as like adult fiction and like very specific. The prose is very precise, like all of these sorts of things. And not that I don't see YA fiction like that, but I think when I think of YA fiction, I view it from a different sort of lens where it's like exploratory and there's room for trying new things and that sort of thing, which isn't also to say that I don't think that literary fiction, like you can't try new things in that. But I think in my mind, because they've been treated as two separate genres and two separate readerships for such a long time that I have such a difficulty like bridging it together. But I don't know. I think that's probably the best answer I can give. Like I'm sure that they can be merged together, but I am still in that place where I'm kind of like seeing it, but not seeing it and like can't really conceptualize it as well as I would like to. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will totally die on this hill, but I maintain that All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy is a YA novel. It is a YA novel. It is a coming-of-age story about a boy who is in Texas, Mexico, that whole area. And it, because it's Cormac McCarthy, it's literary fiction, but it's a YA novel. And I'm just like, the only difference is that it's, you know, he is who he is and he gets everything that he gets because he deserved it. But it is still a YA book.
Right, and you bring up the important point about, you know, the distinction that other people make, right, about between YA and literary and so forth, right? How much of it is marketing, right? How much of it is
he's not a woman, right? There's that whole
yeah.
sticky wicket.
Yeah. So the next question we have from an audience member here is a fun question. If you could cast the movie version of your book, who would play the main character?
I honestly don't know, but I also think that what would be really cool, because while I was writing Like Home, one of the things that I had sort of started watching later in revisions and was one of my comparative titles was On My Block, that Netflix show. And so what I really like about that show in particular is that it's like the cast was primarily like a lot of young actors, really talented actors, but like I hadn't really seen them in anything, but they kind of just fit the role so well and they were like so good together, their chemistry and everything. So I think if Like Home was to be made into like a TV show or a movie or anything, it would be cool to just do like an open audition thing, have like a character description and just kind of be like, find me someone who fits this, as opposed to somebody who maybe like people are used to their face, they're used to their name, and like I don't know, sort of. I think it'd be cool if it was just like a bunch of people that are new and I've never heard of, sort of thing, and then just kind of seeing how their chemistry develops from there.
Yeah, I love that idea too, Louisa. I've been told a lot that the character who plays the main character in Never Have I Ever, Mindy Kaling's Netflix special, she's amazing. Myafri, I can't remember her last name now off the top of my head. I'm really bad with names, but she's wonderful. So I would love to see that happen.
Cool. I have no idea. I was going to say like the rock monster from the Neverending Story because he's probably big enough.
I was going to say that would be the challenge there, finding a big enough actor for that role. Yep. So another question that I'm curious about is how important was it in your novels to address the issue of labeling and othering, right? So for example, you know, Brie, in your novel, there was that, you know, his mom is so sort of confused about, gosh, what should I call you now? What are you now? Because you've fallen for Jamie, and what does this mean, right? And even though his mom is well-intentioned, it seems like she's trying to find a box for him, right? How important was it for you to bring in that conversation, for example?
Oh, very important, because I think for a lot of cisgender heterosexual people, they never envision that one day they could fall for a trans person. What does that make me? So it's like, you are still the same person. Don't worry, it's all good. Love is love. You'll be fine.
And Louisa, in your novel, there was also kind of a sense of trying to label the neighborhood, right? People kept making references to, oh yeah, isn't there gang activity here? Or, isn't there that kind of stuff going on here? So how important was it for you to show that, there's so much to this neighborhood that you can't just, right, narrow it down and say, oh yeah, that's this crime-ridden place?
Yeah, it was pretty important to me because I think a lot of times when like even where I live now and just like in conversations with people that I know, everyone is kind of so quick to categorize certain areas as like, oh, don't go there because that place is really ghetto or this place is that and stuff like that. And I think it's so easy to sort of fall into that without recognizing that like every place kind of has its good and its bad, and that we can't just like categorize or like demonize people that way just because of their circumstance or like whatever, right? Like we don't really know what drives a person to kind of move to a certain place. So it was really important for me to kind of at least shed a bit of light on that and show, at least from Nello's perspective, that like Ginger East maybe wasn't the safest place, but it was still her home and she was still very proud of it, regardless of what there's like a few parts like in the book where there's reporters who come and they kind of say like, oh yeah, lots of gang activity, but also like how many years ago there was like a what was it? Can't remember if it was how they refer to it, like a homicide sort of situation. But like it's all these sorts of things that people will bring up. And so it was important for me to kind of have her, as she was as the main character, like very passionate about where she lived, to kind of show people that like you can't always just paint every place with one brush and that sort of thing.
And Anuradha, obviously this was a very big part of your book, right? Because of the relationship between Oliver and Ronnie and, what that brought out, right?
Yeah, I mean, Oliver is somebody who is drawn to Ronnie because of the way she's different. And in the beginning of the story, she finds that really refreshing and exciting, that finally there's somebody who's interested in me because I'm different. And so that's, how things sort of transpire over the course of the novel. She starts to not necessarily notice that as his home life devolves, he starts to kind of need more from her. So he's really interested in certain aspects of her culture, but the aspect where she really needs to keep this a secret from her parents, like that's just something he cannot wrap his mind around. He cannot come to terms with. And over time, he starts to sort of demand more in that realm from her, and she can't give it. So it's sort of like this impasse. And then over time, it's like he starts to view her in this particular way, that again, she wrestles with feeling flattered, but then also feeling like something is not quite right here. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of the heartbeat of the story, that cultural conflict within intimate relationships, that I feel needs maybe more conversation around, because I do think that in these interpersonal relationships, you have trust. You feel like, well, this person loves me and they couldn't want anything but great things for me. And that could be true. But, when it comes to culture and your own personal sort of identity and your relationship with your parents, when other people have an opinion about that, it starts to get messy and can even lead to, sort of a dangerous sense of losing yourself.
So I guess one last question I'll have for you. So Brie, you mentioned that you're working on your graphic novel. for more of a middle school audience, right? Do any of you see yourselves writing another YA novel or graphic novel in the future? Or is it too soon to even think about that?
Well, the good sign was I had a YA idea that the person responded with, "Oh, I don't think anyone's ready for that." So I'm like, "Ha ha!" And they will be 10 years from now. So that's in progress. But yeah, right now busy with the middle grade.
I'm working on a YA right now. It's again, speaking of, literary fiction and overlaying different genres, I've been told it feels sort of genre bending. So I'm really excited about that idea. And I can't talk too much about it, but it's just something I'm like very obsessive about right now, which is like being like in love with something. It's like I'm in love right now. I can't think much around outside of it at the moment, which is like the best place to be as a writer until, a plot hole comes up, which is inevitable, I'm sure.
I have another YA that I'm working on that will come out next year. I think around this time next year. That it's another contemporary, and it's about like culture and identity, and sort of like how to position yourself in between the two when you have the culture you're sort of born into, but then the culture of the place you live is different, and all that sort of fun stuff. So I'm excited for it.
Great. That's exciting. And we do have another audience question that popped up here about Anuradha talking about the character of Kate in your novel. And of course, as we mentioned before, Kate is also a friend in Louisa's novel. And I had a close friend named Kate when I was a teenager. But our question here is, Anuradha, what was your inspiration? Where did that come from to write Kate as the best friend for Ronnie?
I mean, I feel like at every stage in my own life, I've just had the greatest friends, people who have just sort of called things out when I couldn't. And not just me, but, even just with my kids' friends. And I did actually a lot of research for the book. And I just found that those friendships are really kind of like found family in a sense when you are at that stage in life and you're at school. Your family has really no idea on the day-to-day basis what you're dealing with at school, but your friends do. And so to have a person like that in a story like this, where Ronnie really does feel like she's sort of struggling with her identity, she's at odds with certain elements of her culture, and yet she feels the need to really like protect that culture, to have a friend like Kate who sort of calls stuff out as she sees it and does it in like a completely just, she's just really like outspoken in a way that Ronnie isn't. So it's nice to have that balance, I think, in the story. So yeah, she was a really fun character to write for her sort of feminist views. And she's like actually very sophisticated in her ideas about herself, and the sex positivity conversations that they had were really like filled with a lot of banter and a lot of fun, but sort of a lot of what I felt to be kind of fundamental truths between the two of them. And, especially with relation to their own sexual identities. So yeah, she was one of my favorite characters kind of all time to write.
Well, and that actually leads me to ask you, Brie, how did you come up with JP, right? What a character.
He is the bully that in generally with boys, the bully doesn't do the dirty work. It's the entourage. And so he employs Dylan to do his mean things. Well, he gets to be all like shiny and gorgeous, and then he gives Dylan a seat at the good table, and Dylan is allowed by proxy to be popular and all that stuff. But yeah, no, he's not nice at all. But he has his own problems.
Yeah. And Louisa, I'm curious on the topic of friends, if you had intended that Nello would get together with Rafa in a romantic sense, or, you know, if that's something that kind of happened. It's like, okay, here was this childhood friend of hers, and then it's like, oh, wait, I think maybe he would be a good romantic partner, right? Was that kind of planned from the beginning, or kind of organically evolved?
Yeah, it was pretty much planned from the beginning. I think I'm like a huge sucker for like childhood friends to lovers. It's like my favorite trope of all time. So I'm like, the second I like conceptualize all the characters, I'm like, yeah, what, like these people have to end up together, like those people in this and whatever. So yeah, for sure, that was a decision.
Aw.
And how much did you each feel like you needed to kind of develop that romantic aspect of your novels? And was that, you know, tricky at all? Again, writing about teenagers in that sense.
Ugh, I love that stuff. I love first love. I love it. Ugh, that's the best. Yeah, so I think, like, you know, using the tent pole of Beauty and the Beast, but without the Stockholm syndrome, you know, just trying to employ that all the aspects of like love and infatuation and all the swirly feelings around that is just wonderful. Love it.
Yeah, I agree. It was a bit tricky for me to write though, because I think like when I was a teenager, I was very awkward and like just didn't know how to have conversations with people. So it was difficult. Like it was easy for me to get into that mindset, but it was difficult for me to then write a character who actually was like outgoing in that sense. So that required a bit of editing and just like trying, I think, to like get rid of some of my adolescent fears and whatnot, which is weird how they just crop back up out of nowhere. But like, yeah, it was tricky, but it was, I don't know, rewarding, I think, in that.
Yeah, good way to exorcise those those fears, right?
Yeah.
And Anuradha, how about you? I mean, obviously that relationship again was very central to the novel, like Brie's, but yeah.
It was really essential, and it was, but like Brie said, it was really fun to write. I mean, to have that, to write euphoria and that sort of getting swept away is just, it's just such an enjoyable part of the process. And even though, you know, there were issues and there were problems, that also was, it was sort of just like a really interesting exercise to be writing about somebody that you love so much, and yet you are, you know, sort of continually disappointed or off-put or whatever the case may be. And again, it just felt very real. Like it felt like, wow, I've had a lot of conversations over the course of my lifetime with people who have been in relationships that were less than perfectly healthy, you know? And so on some level, it was actually like, okay, this is just life experiences. It's so easy to like access them based on, you know, even like articles that you read, conversations that you have. I mean, it's everywhere that, you know, how things can sort of go awry. So despite the love being there. So I thought that was actually like a really sort of an intellectual challenge that I found a really cool aspect of writing the book.
Well, we are, I guess, about out of time. So I want to thank each of our authors for this wonderful discussion, for reading passages from your delightful books. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Kim for moderating. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to this evening's sponsor, Skylark Bookshop. The winner of this evening's Q&A prize and soon-to-be recipient of the books American Betiya, Like Home, and Beast is Jennifer Adams Walker. Congratulations, Jennifer. Write to mail@unboundbookfestival.com with your name and address, and they will send copies of these books to you. On March 25th at 7 p.m., we'll be back with Healthcare Poetry, featuring poets who are also healthcare providers, such as Hala Alian, C. Dale Young, and Amy Haddad. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.